بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Last week we began the station of al-Khuluq, good manners, and today inshallah we'll continue exploring it. And Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayh says that ad-din kulluhu khuluq. The entirety of religion and piety is manners. In other words, there is a very, very strong relationship between manners and piety. And last week we went over various ahadith that indicate this. And one of the ones that I don't think Ibn Qayyim mentioned, but I did mention, was when it comes to marriage. Who should you marry your daughter to? Or who should you marry your son to? Well, the Prophet ﷺ says that the one who has piety and manners, then marry them. Right? A man comes to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage, and he has piety and he has manners, then the Prophet ﷺ says that's what you want. Marry her off to him. Don't ask the other questions that are really irrelevant, like where is he from, what's his ethnicity, what's his, these various other cultural questions that sometimes get in the way between marriage and makes marriage difficult and more complicated than it needs to be. So we find that the Prophet ﷺ relates these two. And in another variation of the same hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, if someone comes to you asking for marriage, and they have good manners and piety, so switch the orders, right, to show us how intertwined these two are. And the question is, why? Why is it that manners has this fundamental role when it comes to piety? To an extent that it is really implausible to find someone who is pious but ill-mannered. It's very difficult to find that. You could find someone who is very well-mannered but doesn't have religion, doesn't have piety, but the opposite, you really can't find that. So what's the deal? Why is that? And so as we go through this section within this station, hopefully it begins to kind of become clearer. So Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi says that whoever increases their manners, their piety will also increase as well. Okay, so this is why, as we mentioned last week, that the scholars focused just as much, if not more, on learning manners as they did when it comes to learning Islam. A scholar would say, I learned Islam for 20 years. I spent 20 years learning Islam, and I spent 40 years learning manners. And these very successful scholars, they would refuse to take knowledge from someone who doesn't have good manners. Back in the day, in the times of the Salaf, it is pretty much impossible to find a scholar, a reputable scholar, who does not have pristine manners. Today, you do have a bit of a disconnect. Why? Because there isn't this focus on manners as there was back in the day. So what's the deal? Why is manners so interconnected with piety? To the extent that Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi says that you increase your manners, you're increasing your piety as well. Well, good manners, right, are really founded on 4 characteristics. So if you were to make a list of all of good manners, all types of good manners, make a list out of it, you could probably find dozens upon dozens. But all of these manners go back to 4 fundamental characteristics. Number 1, as-sabr, patience. Number 2, al-iffa. Iffa is iffa in common vernacular Arabic today. It refers to someone who is modest. Right? Modest in the gender sense, like between genders. But iffa in the classical usage of this word is a little bit broader. Yes, it does include the modesty when it comes to dealing with the opposite gender, but it also includes modesty when it comes to wealth, right? Such as not wanting what's in the hands of other people. That is a type of iffa. Not saying or being where you're not supposed to be. You have sometimes those obnoxious people who always put themselves where they shouldn't be, where they're not invited. right? Part of Iffa is avoiding such behaviors. That you see yourself as more dignified, more noble, more respectful than to, to do things that will bring about this negative opinion from people. So that's the second one, al-Iffa. So we'll just call it modesty. Number 3, ash-shuja'a, courage. And number 4, al-adl, justice. So why these 4? I mentioned that I was trying to find certain characteristics that are fundamental. That if we focus on these characteristics, then it will help improve our iman to a good extent. And then I find Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah gives us 4. The 5 that I came up with are actually quite different than these 4. But let's see why Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah chose these 4. So, sabr, patience. Why is patience a fundamental characteristic? That many other characteristics and good manners fall under it. Well, it is because through or with patience and through patience, it helps prevent them from transgressing. So patience is this restrictive characteristic, a characteristic that restricts the person from doing haram. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises the people of patience and advises the believers to adhere to the principles of patience when dealing with difficulties, the idea is that you behave in a way that not only restricts yourself from going into the haram, but also you behave in a way that's beautiful and praiseworthy. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, give glad tidings to the ones who are patient. الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Those who are afflicted but with a hardship or a calamity, they say, we belong to Allah and to Allah is our return. What does Allah say afterwards in response to such people? أُولَٰئِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ صَلَوَاتٌ مِّن رَبِّهِمْ وَرَحْمَةٌ. These are the people who Allah praises. Why? Because when they adhere to patience, they behave in a praiseworthy way. And thus Allah responds to that patience by praising them. Subhanallah. So the idea is that with patience, it restricts us from doing that which is the opposite of good manners. It restricts us from bad manners. Right? Also, patience gives us the ability to persevere through building iman. Building iman doesn't come about overnight. The scholars have always expressed concern with the piety of young individuals. In other words, when you see a teenager, in our terminology today, when a teenager all of a sudden becomes extremely religious, right? It's not that they were always doing this since they were 10 years old, and they're just kind of continuing a path they were already on. It's when they hit 15, 16, 17, sometimes 18, this age, and they weren't practicing before, but all of a sudden they're, in the masjid 5 times a day. And they're fasting every other day, right? There is a concern there. Why? Because these young individuals have yet to develop the characteristics that are necessary for not only maintaining iman, but actually building real iman. So what you find is that these young individuals who all of a sudden begin to practice, if they go through a hardship, they very often leave, they stop. Or they overburden themselves in their piety and they begin to, regress a little bit and a little bit until they stop practicing. Why is that? It's not that, let's say we live in a Muslim country where, every block or every neighborhood has a masjid. It's not difficult to pray 5 times a day in the masjid. I mean, it's literally there. You just walk. You just walk 5 minutes, you're in the masjid, walk 5 minutes back, you go back to work. So it's not that praying 5 times a day is difficult in of itself, or that it's impossible to maintain a habit or a routine of fasting that is every other day or twice a week. It's that these individuals, because they haven't developed the patience necessary for Iman, with time they overburden themselves and their Iman begins to erode and fade out. So the scholars understood that if I want real Iman, strong Iman, then there are these necessary characteristics that I must develop in order to maintain the Iman, in order to maintain these virtuous behaviors. It's not that praying 5 times a day in the masjid isn't something advised in the Sharia. It is advised. Some scholars, a very minority, but some scholars have held the opinion that a man is obligated to pray every salah in the masjid. Right? Now, of course, they're speaking from an Islamic country where there's a masjid right next door. So that's possible. In our times today, obviously, that's not possible. So it's not that these aren't part of the sunnah, but that you cannot just do them unless you have these characteristics, among which is sabr. So patience allows us the ability to restrict ourselves from doing the haram, and also to persevere through these virtuous behaviors, which sometimes can become heavy on a person. The first day of Ramadan is difficult on all of us. Maybe in the first 2-3 days are difficult on us. We have the caffeine withdrawal, no more coffee. Our bodies aren't used to fasting or not eating for that period of time. Every first day of Ramadan, I get a severe migraine by the end of the day. Right? And I cannot eat once it's iftar time. I have to take small bites. But what do we have to do even though this happens? We have to be patient. Why doesn't a child fast? Why isn't it obligatory on a child to fast? They don't have that patience. It's not developed. So patience is necessary to our Iman in that it prevents us from doing the haram, and it gives us the ability to complete our obligations as well as the sunnah and the mustahab acts of Islam. So that's why it's fundamental. Number 2, iffa, modesty. Again, modesty has a restricting factor, right? And it also has a behavioral factor. Iffa restricts us from going outside what is ours, going outside what is halal. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلْيَسْتَعْفِفِ الَّذِينَ لَا يَجِدُونَ نِكَاحًا حَتَّى يُغْنِيَهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. The one who is unable to get married because they don't have the financial ability to get married, then Allah tells them to adhere to the principles of iffa, modesty. Stay modest until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides you the rizq, the provisions to get married. Okay? And you see that this also demands patience. So what is the difference? Right? It seems like a person cannot have iffa unless they have patience. And patience is part of iffa. But what is the difference? Iffa is more about something that is there, something that you can tangibly observe, but it doesn't belong to you, or it's not halal for you. Whereas sabr is more about the reactionary factor. Someone said something inappropriate to you. How do you respond? You respond with patience. You don't respond with iffa. Right? Whereas if you see someone, with wealth, they're wealthy and you wish you had that wealth, you respond not with patience per se, but with iffa, with modesty. Right? This perception that is not mine. It's not mine for me to take, but on top of that, Allah gave that person that money. And Allah gave me whatever I have. So the iffa element is about recognizing how Allah distributed these things. That my iffa, my modesty, goes back to the notion that Allah يَبْسُطُ الرِّزْقَ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيَقْدِرُ. Allah expands provisions on whom He wills, and He restricts provisions from whom He wills. And so my iffa is about accepting what Allah has provided me. It's about recognizing that what is mine came from Allah, and what is theirs was given to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that by wanting to put my hand on something that's not mine. It's as if I am transgressing the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Now, we're not going to say that someone who does this has committed kufr, right? Or is, an enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm just giving the kind of perception behind it. The more a person recognizes Allah's role as Ar-Razzaq, the provider, and that how He distributes wealth and provisions across His creation, that is entirely based on His wisdom and His knowledge, then I will have the modesty to recognize that is that person's according to Allah's distribution. This is mine according to Allah's distribution. So, Iffa prevents us from behaving in indecent ways. It promotes modest behavior, among which is haya, ethical modesty. We went over the station not too long ago. So, haya is a branch of Iffa. So, Iffa is the modesty, all of the modesty in all of its forms. Whereas haya is kind of the ethical elements of modesty. Also, Iffa restricts us from committing indecencies. It restricts us from anything that is unpraiseworthy, such as stinginess, such as lying, such as backbiting and slandering. All this goes back to Iffa. Number 3, ash-shuja'a, courage. So, courage, when we think of courage, we all have an idea in our mind. A courageous person is someone who confronts, and they have, they're a warrior and they're willing to put it all on the line. Again, that's a kind of Hollywood perception of courage. Courage, in the classical Arabic usage of the word, courage is about doing the right thing at the right time. So courage isn't about displaying certain aggressive behaviors as a means of confronting, someone else in whether it's a good way or a bad way, but courage is about doing the right thing at the right time. And so someone who, let's say, has power over someone else to punish them for a wrong that they did, but they choose something that is more praiseworthy in Islam, such as as-safh wal-afu, pardoning them and forgiving them. That is an act of courage. So the person refraining from punishing someone else who is deserving of that punishment because the Sharia would prefer something more noble, right? That is an act of courage. Why? Because they did the right thing at the right time. So courage is sometimes about holding yourself back when you do have the ability to, be on the offensive side. And courage really develops, this characteristic of courage develops many other characteristics, such as self-worth. That I have a dignity, and part of courage is preserving that dignity. So, for example, when we see in movies people partying and whatnot, and doing very lewd and obnoxious things, right? Standing in front of everyone and dancing. Courage in Islam is a characteristic that will prevent us from doing something like that. It is courageous to preserve your self-worth and your self-dignity. Also, good manners in general requires courage. Oftentimes, we fall into certain behaviors because of the hegemony, the dominance of culture and tradition. So, for example, maybe we've all kind of had to deal with this. Our child wants to marry outside of our ethnicity, for example. And there is some stigma behind that. And so, parents have restricted their children from marrying someone because they don't fit certain customs of their particular land. See, that is an act of, according to this, an act of cowardice. Why? Because what's driving their behavior is the stigma and the customs and the tradition. Whereas if the person does not look at that, but rather looks at what the Prophet ﷺ says, and understands that this person who's asking for my daughter's hand in marriage is someone of piety and someone of manners. And the Prophet ﷺ says, marry them. If that's the case, let the marriage happen. And so I follow that despite the stigma that might come about, despite the customs of the land. That is an act of courage. So a lot of times it's the cultural factors that is driving our behaviors. And so it restricts some of our good manners. It restricts our ability to follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And so shuja'a, courage, is about recognizing what the Sharia praises and behaves accordingly, instead of being confined to the stigmas and the stereotypes of our culture and our land. Also, courage gives us the ability to be generous. To me, when I looked at, when I developed my own, or I wrote down what I think are the 5 fundamental characteristics, I put generosity as being one of them. And my perception was generosity develops courage. But here Ibn Qayyim flips it. It is courage that develops generosity. Because let's face it, when we give an amount of money in charity, that requires an amount of courage. The courage to let go of something that is dear to you, not knowing how that might affect our future in terms of our financial stability. Right? That requires an amount of courage. Also, when we give charity, all of us do it with the iman that Allah is going to replenish what we spent, going to replace what we spent. Now, we don't know when, we don't know how. In fact, we're not 100% sure Allah is even going to accept our charity. So when we give charity, it demands an amount of courage. I have the courage to do this, to let go of what is dear and near to me, to let go of something that brings me pleasure and joy, to let go of something that sustains my livelihood, without knowing what's going to come in return, without knowing the outcome. So when a soldier charges the enemy forces, right, they're doing it with courage. Why? Because they don't know what the consequence is going to be. They understand the potential sacrifice. I might lose my life as a result of my action. What is going to come about because of my action, I don't know. So you find something similar when it comes to generosity. And generosity is a huge factor of iman, because a generous heart is a big heart. And the bigger our heart is, the more room there is for iman. And this is why you find that the reputable scholars, right? When you look at the huge scholars of our tradition, you'll always find them generous people. Generosity, as we've gone over before, isn't just in money. Generosity is also in your words, being generous with your words, generous with your time, generous with your demeanor, your character, how you engage people. So not every scholar was rich. In fact, the standard was scholars weren't rich at all. Some were, but most weren't. So it's not about them being generous with their money, but when they dealt with people, they were generous. Why? Because, you need a big heart in order to have that knowledge. And because they had a big heart, there was more room for knowledge and iman to find a home in their heart. And all elements of Islam requires an amount of courage. Because if courage is about doing something that is demanding on the individual without knowing what the result is going to be, we do salah. It demands time. And sometimes we need to pray in a very inconvenient location. That's a fact of the matter. And yeah, we're doing this hoping for the reward of Allah, but can anyone guarantee themselves that they're going to get that reward? We can't guarantee ourselves. We are hopeful in Allah promises, right? And that if we fulfill what Allah demands, then no doubt Allah's promise is truth and will come. But how do we know? We can never guarantee ourselves that we fulfilled what Allah demanded of us. And so there is an amount of courage there. I'm doing this. I'm sacrificing from my time. With zakah, I'm sacrificing from my wealth. With fasting, I'm sacrificing from my energy and my pleasures. With hajj, I'm sacrificing from all of these. In a hope, out of hope and iman, belief, faith that Allah is going to reward me. But there is no guarantee there. We cannot guarantee ourselves. And this is why iman bil ghaib, faith in the unknown, is faith that really matters. We don't say, I have faith that the sky is blue. This is just, it doesn't make sense. What do you mean you have faith that the sky is blue? You see it right in front of you. It's not an issue of faith. Faith is something that is, you don't know for sure. Right? Or I should say, there is an element of ambiguity. It's not tangible. It's not a guarantee per se. And so you say, I have faith that my son is going to do the right thing. Because you can't guarantee yourself that he's going to do the right thing. And so when you say, I have belief in Allah, yes, we have a certainty there. But that certainty is not built on physical observation, but rather through something that demands more reflection, more time, more contemplation. You know, it's not like you show someone the Quran and say, yes, I believe that Allah is there and I believe that Islam is the truth. It's not the way it works. And this is why iman here in the unseen is iman that means something. That requires an amount of courage. So when our brothers and sisters who revert to Islam, when they do that, I mean, there is an insane amount of courage there. Because, you know, at that time, very few people accept Islam with the 100% certitude that this is the truth, but rather they feel that it's the truth. And it's something they need to develop with time. And they're not sure what the result is going to be. They're completely changing their lives. Complete overhaul of their life. They have to leave all that behind, all of their life behind. And more often than not, their families are unsupportive. You know, there's this one, I saw a video of a sister who accepted Islam. She said, before, you know, I had such a loving relationship with my father. After she accepted Islam and told him, you know, that relationship completely died out. Or at least it was damaged. And he said some hurtful things. I mean, to do that and to remain on Islam afterwards, that is an insane amount of courage. So courage, ash-shuja'a, is a fundamental characteristic of not only of good manners, but also of iman. And so the Prophet ﷺ says in one hadith, لَيْسَ الشَّدِيدُ بِالصَّرَعَ إِنَّمَا الشَّدِيدُ الَّذِي يَمْلِكُ نَفْسَهُ عِنْدَ الْغَضَبِ. The strong person is not the one who is able to overpower their opponent, like in wrestling or in a boxing match. Rather, the strong person is the one who holds him or herself when they are extremely angry. So Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah is referencing this hadith under courage. To go back to what we said before, courage is about doing the right thing at the right time. That is courage. And then finally, al-adil, justice. Why? Now, justice is not the best translation for this word, but rather al-adil here is probably the better translation is moderation. Being moderate in your piety and in your akhlaq, in your manners. Why? Because any one of these characteristics, any good manner, right, there's a spectrum in its application. For example, being nice with other people. If you are not nice, then you are at kind of an extreme side. And that's not good manners. Not being nice is not good manners. But on the other side, being too nice can also be damaging. Being too nice can also cause us to lose a little bit of iman. Because being too nice can lead to the flourishment of injustice. So for example, take a judge. Should a judge be a nice person? I'm talking about in the courtroom. Should they be a nice person? No. I'm not saying be mean, but being too nice, what's going to happen? The criminals are going to get away. The criminals will get away. And so being a judge requires a lot of moderation in the way they are, the way they present him or herself, and also the way they deal with other people. Why? Because if they are too loose, then injustice will flourish and will escape. But if they're too mean, then the weaker of society will be kind of punished more than, on top of their difficulties. So the judge needs to have enough flexibility to forgive the small things, like a parking ticket, like this and like that, the small things. To be able to forgive the teenager who made a dumb mistake. That when they see remorse, regret from the one being prosecuted, that they lower the sentence. When they see good behavior of the inmates, that they reduce the sentence. There needs to be that amount of flexibility, but they got to be very moderate. Same thing with generosity. You're too generous, your kids are going to go hungry. And thus, you are neglecting an obligation, an Islamic obligation upon you. Taking care of your kids, if you're too generous. If you're too stingy, not only is that going to harm your iman, you're going to harm society as well. Especially your family members. The first people who are going to be harmed from a person's stinginess is their spouse. The first person, and then their children. So you need that moderation. The same thing goes with all things. Okay, so those are the 4 fundamental characteristics of good manners. Again, patience, modesty, courage, and moderation. There are also 4 characteristics of bad manners. 4 fundamental characteristics of bad manners. So if there are 4 primary characteristics of good manners, there are 4 primary characteristics of bad manners. What are they? Al-Jahl, ignorance. Al-Vulun, injustice. Al-Shahwa, desire. And Al-Ghadab, anger. These 4 characteristics, all bad manners fall under them. So if you want to improve your iman, if you want to improve your akhlaq, then you have to work on getting rid of these 4. Likewise, if you want to improve your iman, improve your akhlaq, you got to build the 4 we just went over. So let's go over them. Al-Jahl, ignorance. Why is ignorance a primary characteristic of bad manners? Well, I think this is quite obvious. Go to any society where ignorance is widespread. How do people behave? I mean, it's very obvious. They behave, with bad manners. They engage people in inappropriate ways. I'm not talking about sexually inappropriate, but just this is not the way you deal with other human beings. Their application of their religion is going to be very problematic. So ignorance is a primary characteristic of bad manners. And when you look at, for example, I don't want to use anything. I'm not going to use an example. I'll leave it to you. I think you all notice this. I'll give you one example of my time in Jordan. Like the ignorance of people when it comes to standing in line. Just stand in line. There's a line. First come, first serve. You see a line, right? Just stand behind the last person. It's very simple. But an ignorant person, what are they going to do? they're going to cut in line. Right? And not only will they cut in line, they will do it not realizing that they're doing something wrong. And if you confront them, they'll look at you like, what's your problem? What are you talking about? I'm just coming. I'm standing in line like you. How do you deal with these people? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, الأعراب أشد كفرا ونفاقا وأجدر أن لا يعلموا حدود ما أنزل الله على رسوله. That the Bedouins are greater in their hypocrisy, right? And their kufr, and their disbelief. Why? Because they are more distant from knowing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, because of their ignorance, there is more room for hypocrisy and disbelief to develop in their hearts. Now, this doesn't mean that every single Bedouin is, a hypocrite or a disbeliever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the following verses mentions that among the Bedouins are those who believe in Allah and His Messenger, and they are willing to sacrifice in their cause. They love them, and Allah is going to reward them for it. But the idea here is that when ignorance prevails, it allows a foundation for hypocrisy and disbelief to grow. So when you look at the colonial era of the Muslim world, you find that there is a lot of ignorance there in that time. And as a result, you have a lot of strange movements occurring, on top of the confusion that is occurring as a result of colonialism. Also, when you look at pre-colonialism, whenever knowledge of Islam decreases, whenever the number of scholars present in a society decreases, you also have innovations increase. You have hypocrisy increase. You have division within the ummah. So ignorance is something that is bad, and we need to fight against it. And you notice that one of the first characteristics that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the human being in Surah Al-Baqarah, in fact, the first human characteristic Allah describes in the history of humanity, right, in the Quran, is knowledge. As if Allah is telling us that the human being was created with knowledge and for knowledge. And the more a human being develops knowledge, I'm talking about fruitful knowledge, because there's knowledge that is nothing more than information in a person's mind, but there's knowledge that actually shapes the person. I'm talking about the second one. Right? The more we do that, the better the human being will become. Right? Also, with ignorance comes poor hygiene. And we have this stereotype. Ignorant people are not only ignorant in the way they behave with one another, but the way they treat their bodies. They'll make fun of people who take a shower every day and who use like soap and stuff like this. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, during the dark ages of Europe, right, it was prestigious to have, very bad teeth, like cavities and these spots on your teeth, yellow teeth, etc. Why? Because it was a sign that you eat a lot of sugar. Meaning you have sweets, and sweets was something only the wealthy people had. So they had these bad teeth. Using soap was like, a taboo. Oh, you're using soap to make fun of people. Ignorance, leads to this. And this is why knowledge in Islam is so centralized in our tradition. There's so much reward for seeking knowledge of Islam. Allah says that the people of khushu', those who have khashya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who have awe of Allah, are the scholars. Those who are able to take their knowledge and convert it to a spiritual experience, a way to engage Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, among other things. So, knowledge is power in Islam. Knowledge is iman. Of course, I mean pure knowledge, good knowledge, because there's bad knowledge. And jahil, ignorance, is the exact opposite. Number 2, al-Vulun, injustice. Now, the word dhulm is defined in the Arabic language as putting something where it doesn't belong, misplacing something. And from there, people translate it as injustice. Why? Because injustice is treating someone the way they don't deserve to be treated. So it's not about, punishing someone, and then any punishment is an act of injustice. No, sometimes punishment is justice. Someone does a crime, they transgress against someone else, so the court punishes the person. That is an act of justice. But it is called justice. Why? Because the punishment was placed in the proper place. And the punishment was commensurate to the crime of the person. Whereas injustice is when someone is punished when they aren't deserving of punishment. They're innocent and they're being punished. That's an act of injustice. Or they were punished with a punishment greater than the crime. So what you find happening in France to Muslims and whatnot in other places of the world. So injustice is about misplacing our behaviors, behaving inappropriately. And from here we can see why and how this is related to Iman. So if al-adil, in the good characteristics, moderation is part of Iman, then the opposite is obviously improper. So being unjust is a misapplication, a misuse, an abuse of our resources and what we are supposed to do and how we're supposed to behave with other people. So you see how it's an opposite to pretty much the good characteristics that we went over. And it's important to also understand injustice in a broader sense. That when we use the word injustice today, it's primarily focusing on social and political injustices. The government was unjust towards their people. These demographics within America are treated unjustly by the government. There are laws that are unjust towards certain members of our society. That's pretty much how we use it today. But again, in the Islamic context, it's broader than that. Being humble in a time when you need to be strong and confront someone else, being humble in that scenario is actually an act of injustice. So going back to the judge, if you have a defendant and you have a prosecutor, the prosecutor claims that the defendant assaulted her, right? And you know that the defendant is someone of high stature in society. If the judge were to act humbly with the defendant, and as a result, the prosecutor is not able to get her justice, then the judge acted unjustly. Why? Because they were humble in a time and in a place where it's not a time for humility. Rather, it's a time for a show of strength. Does that make sense? So, also, injustice can be applied to the self, done to the self. This is a way we don't use it in our times today. No one can say, I did an injustice to myself. I mean, we don't really use it that way. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says many times in the Quran, ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ. They did injustice to themselves. How so? By preventing the self from its needs, from the source of happiness that it yearns for, by doing things that is harmful to the self. So when someone drinks alcohol, we say they are doing an injustice to themselves. Why? Because they are harming the self. And it's leading to greater harm. And so it's an injustice. Number 3, ash-shahwa, and that is desire. Now, desire is something Allah created us with. And sometimes engaging our desire is actually praiseworthy. It actually gets us reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How so? Well, the Prophet ﷺ says that whoever has a relationship with their spouse, then Allah rewards them for it. So the companions asked, Ya Rasulullah, we engage our desires and we get rewarded for that. So the Prophet ﷺ said that, would you not get sins if you put it or you engage someone intimately who you're not supposed to engage? Meaning you had a haram relationship. He said, of course you'd get sin. So the opposite holds true. When you engage intimacy in a halal way, you get rewarded for it. Right? So not all desires are bad. So how does Ibn al-Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi, to avoid kind of this discrepancy here, how does he define shahwa? Or what is kind of the type of shahwa that he's referring to? He's talking about desires that cause the person to be to fall into al-hirs wal-shuh wal-bukhl, to become stingy, to become selfish, and to become overly attached to the world. This is the desires. So let's face it, desires, human desires, is about pursuing quick gratification. We think about desires, whether halal or haram. Our desires for wealth, right? We all want to be rich. And what happens as a result is that many people fall into the trap of getting rich quick. You know how they have these schemes and they have the way things are advertised, get rich fast. People are attracted to that. Why? Because it's a desire. They want it now. They feel it now, and therefore they want to satisfy it now. So what happens is when a person's desires has control of them, they have this attachment to this life, a pursuit of this life that is unhealthy. And because they want to gratify the self, it leads to stinginess and selfishness. Why? Because generosity and courage is about giving to someone else, doing for someone else, doing for a greater cause. That is the opposite of shahwa. Why? Because it's not gratifying the self. It's about doing the right thing, even at the expense of my own gratifications and satisfactions. So shahwa is really one of the the founding characteristics of bad manners and of haram behaviors. The person pursues their desires. And then finally, ghadab, anger. Why? Because anger causes the person to become arrogant, causes their heart to be filled with resentment and with jealousy and envy, and causes the person to act ignorantly and also to transgress against other people. These are 5 very, very bad characteristics. As for safa, to act foolishly, well, that goes back to ignorance. When someone is very angry, even if they are a scholar, or even if they are a very noble person, a king or whatever, when they get angry, they kind of lose control of the self. This is why the Prophet ﷺ tells us, La taghdab, la taghdab, la taghdab. Don't get angry, don't get angry, don't get angry. Because it is a door for the shaitan to influence you, and also a door for us to fall into haram. It leads to transgressing against other people, because anger isn't something that just comes randomly. It's not like your body naturally produces anger hormones, and then Dr. Farah can correct me if I'm wrong, but rather there's something that triggers it. There's something that bothers you, and then you are angry. You're not just sitting home on your chair and just watching TV, and all of a sudden you get angry and start throwing things. Man, if you do that, then we assume that there's something that came to your mind, or an event that happened that is bothering you. So when a person gets angry, it tends to be because of something someone else did. And then the person wants to attack the other person because now they are angry. And that can lead to haram. When you look at murder events or murder cases in the Eastern world, the Muslim world, most murders occur out of anger. 2 people get mad at each other, They start fighting, and the other person throws a rock at them, takes out a gun and shoots them in a moment of anger. Right? Contrary to what we see in the West, where it's like planned murders and whatnot. It tends to be this moment of anger and the person murders someone else. Envy. Because when someone makes me mad, if I feel superior to that person, I don't mean that in an arrogant sense, but when your child, let's say, gets you angry, it's not the same as when someone else, another adult gets you angry. Why? Because, well, you know that you can punish the child. You know that the child is just behaving sillily. So you might be angry. It's more of a frustration than it is an anger. But someone else, there is this element of envy. That, how dare you? Who you think you're better than me to do these things? Who do you think you are? And if you see that person as superior or having more than you, then that kind of further frustrates that anger. Resentment. It causes resentment. It causes arrogance as well. So these are 4 characteristics that are primary to bad behaviors and bad manners. And when you look at whether they're the 4 primary good or the 4 primary bad, what you find is that they build off each other. They build off each other. The more courage a person has, the more modesty they have. Because a courageous person will be okay with not having something. A courageous person is okay with their situation. I don't need what's in the hands of other people. Also, being moderate in our characteristics will help us be patient. It will help us apply patience that is healthy to our iman. Being ignorant leads to increased desires, because it is when we are ignorant of the harms of something, we freely and openly abuse it. Look at vaping, for example. Every now and then you get this new practice. Oh, there's nothing wrong with it, it's okay. And then studies come out, vaping, causes the lungs to be like popcorn. You are injecting literally metal into your bloodstream and whatnot. And then you have these campaigns, public campaigns, trying to raise awareness of the harms of vaping. Oh, okay, it's bad and whatnot. So ignorance and desires really go hand in hand. What you find is that the more ignorant a person is, the more ignorant a society is, the more they engage their desires. Among other things, anger and injustice, they go hand in hand. A lot of these unjust rulers, it's as if they are invoking their anger against society. They're mad at something, and therefore they're punishing the entire world or their entire society, unfortunately. So it builds off each other. Also, it's important to understand the dynamics of characteristics. Whether good or bad, you find that every good characteristic is surrounded by bad characteristics. Okay. So you have, for example, courage. Pretend courage is in the middle. On the left, you have cowardice, being a coward. And on the right, you have being reckless. So this is a good characteristic that is threatened by 2 other unpraiseworthy characteristics, cowardice and recklessness. So you need to be moderate in your application of courage. When you look at, so in order for us to truly apply and develop these good characteristics, we need to understand what's threatening them. We need to understand the spectrum when it comes to this characteristic. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why scholars focus so much on learning characteristics, learning good manners. Why? Because there are dynamics at play. It's not random. Right? And therefore you need to know what really is courage. And when is my courage actually recklessness? And when is my quote-unquote courage actually cowardice? Coward behavior. So this needs to be learned. And we need to be moderate in all of our characteristics. And therefore, whenever we deviate from the moderation of a characteristic, it leads us to one of two poor or negative characteristics. And then Ibn Qayyim rahmatullah alayhi gives an analogy, and I'm going to paraphrase it for you here. He does go into pretty good detail. He gives an analogy, and we'll end with this, of water. When it rains, and you get an abundance of rain, you have land. If the land is flat, then the land, the dirt absorbs it absorbs the water, and it irrigates the land. But if the land is hilly or mountainous, it forms into kind of streams and whatnot, as we see in our terrain here. Now, if you are a farmer and you're living on the foothills of a mountain or the foothills of hills, and it rains, what these farmers do is that they dig a type of channel that the water will gather in, and thus it will be channeled in a particular way. And the way they do it is that the water will be able to collect and go through their land in the most efficient way. Okay? Now, that channel needs to be engineered. And in order to properly do it, you need knowledge of the dirt. You need knowledge of kind of how the water flows when we get rain. There's a kind of a pathway it follows. You also need to know your agriculture. How much water does your crops need? Some crops need more water, some crops need less. Right? And if the ones that need less, if it gets too much, it could die. And the ones that need a lot, if it doesn't get enough, it could die. Right? Among other things. So you have these various elements. What do we do now? Well, for some people, they're not going to do anything. Whatever rain comes, it irrigates the land, and as they say, leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore they lose out because they don't take the time to think about this and consider it and to develop it and make a channel for this water. They lose out on a lot of rain. They don't get the most out of it. And you have other people who become, for example, very stingy. They build too big of a channel, or they misdirect the channel, and it causes flooding or causes other problems. So the smart person is the one who engineers a channel in a way that they're going to get the most out of the rain and the best result from that rain. So they're between two extremes, the extreme of not caring and not doing anything about what's there, and the extreme of becoming too stingy with it and wanting too much, and thus damaging the crops and causing it to die or be flooded. So when it comes to characteristics, you have something similar. We have various factors in our lives, and therefore we need to study it and then engineer our characteristics in a way where we get the most out of it, or else we kind of either miss out or we damage ourselves. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Let us stop here. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.